For the next episode of Children of Heroes, we travel to Tevesham at the outskirts of Cambridge, where we talk to Mr. Alexander Scott, son of Flight Lieutenant Jaromír Střihavka.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father was a Royal Air Force pilot during the Second World War. Could you tell us more about him?
He joined the Czech army at Prostějov in 1932, took 2 years of training and then became a pilot, served with the Czech Air Force until the Germans invaded, and a lot of the Czech pilots escaped through Poland to France. They joined the French Air Force, and then the Germans invaded France, and he escaped to the UK and joined the RAF. That's him at 18 when he first joined. And that's a monument when he was in training still. And that's in Lipnica. It's a very small village that my father was born. In this house. And that's the first really good photo of him with his pilot's helmet and goggles. And that's the first plane that he flew in. I think that's in Slovakia. And that's them in the barracks. So that's his early days. And then he went up. So that was corporal.
Much older now.
Yeah, and then sergeant. And then you can see his Czech wings. That was his career in Czechoslovakia as it was then. Then they had to escape to France, and the planes that they flew were not particularly nice. And they all flew together. So they flew in Czechia, they flew in France, and they flew in the UK. Then he came to the UK with a lot of Czech. I think there was a whole boatload that arrived from France. And that's my father.
With a dog or a cat?
Yes, that's why he was called Scott.
Oh, okay.
Because it's what we call a Scotty dog. And this is at Duxford. That's a Hurricane, and that's the Czech Squadron 310. This is when he joined a British squadron, 19th Squadron. And this is in Norfolk. And this is President Beneš when he visited Exeter, I think in 1943. And he gave my father the Czech War Cross and Gallantry Medal. This is my father getting in a Spitfire during the war, in colour. Being strapped in. That's a course that he attended while he was here in the UK, Fighter Command School of Tactics in April 1943. So he had a long career of flying. Then it was time to go home.
Yeah, after the war he returned back to Czechoslovakia.
He did.
How was it for him?
This is him about to leave. So he's sitting on the Spitfire that he left Manston, RAF Manston, in August 45. There were 3 squadrons, 310, 312 and 313. And my father returned with 313. They had quite a lot of bad weather, so it took them about a week to get to Prague. And that's when they landed in Ryzín, 313 Squadron. Then they had the parade of them all coming back. So this is through Prague. That's my mother and father in Prague. My father was due to go to Ecuador.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you because it was in 1947 that he
Yes,
was
he had
supposed to
tickets.
immigrate to Ecuador.
He was going to go. He was going.
the son of
The president of, correct.
But the plan didn't.
The plan
work
didn't
out.
happen due to the ship sank, so he never went. My mother's father sent the money for everything for them to go. How the arrangement actually happened, I don't know, because my grandfather was living in Ecuador at the time. So maybe that was something to do with it. But it was a shock. I didn't know that. And that only came out when I had some of the documents from the archives in Prague. But to teach someone to fly, that's what he wanted to do. He obviously knew that things weren't going particularly well in the Czechoslovakia at the time. My father was fortunate that when all the people from the RAF returned back to Prague, a lot of them didn't continue in the Air Force. So a lot of them were disbanded. But my father carried on in the Air Force. He wasn't political. But if you look at the reports that he was getting, they were going, as the communists obviously took control, they obviously didn't want the people like my father in the Air Force anymore. So he decided in 1948, my mother escaped to Vienna because she was Austrian, and my father luckily escaped because a lot of them were thrown into prison. When I could start getting the records from Prague, I pulled his service record because I didn't know what medals that he had. So I got those. I also managed to get the STB file on my father, which was about that thick. So they were watching all of the pilots.
I suppose he didn't know about it.
No, I think he knew at the end. And in it was a letter that my mother had written from the UK to the family, and it was in the file. When my father decided to leave Prague, he just left everything in the flat, everything. Luckily, my mum took the logbook and various bits and pieces. His medals, all his medals were left on the table. His revolver, all his uniform. It's probably the most important thing that I have. This is like the holy grail for any family member to have the logbook of their parents. It gives you all the flights. So if we go sort of like, say, D-Day, so it gives you the date, 5th of June, 6th of June, 7th of June, 8th of June, and these little squares are donated by an operational sortie. So not just normal flying, it's an operational flight. So this goes all the way from 1940 until it goes, actually, when he went back to Prague. So 46, when they were still flying the Spitfires. So these are the most valuable items that I have because they're irreplaceable and priceless for me. The reason he managed to escape, he told me, the person that was watching him, he knew from school and sort of turned a blind eye and off he went. Must have been very difficult for all of them, especially for the family, because the family had suffered because of he was in the Air Force with the Nazis, and then again they suffered because of the communists. So we were a bit apprehensive how they would be when we went back, because until 1990 he couldn't go back. He was stripped of his rank, stripped of his medals, and was classed as a deserter. But when we went back, it was amazing, absolutely amazing. The problem was he got so wrapped up in being there, he would speak to us in Czech and them in English. So he got it completely the wrong way around.
What did he do after he returned?
Yeah, that was a difficult period because my father was slightly older than a lot of the other pilots because, you know, he started flying in 1932. It was his career. It wasn't something that he went into because of the war. So they had a lot of pilots, and he'd only really had experience in single-engine aircraft. He wanted to retrain to be a commercial pilot, but it just wasn't possible. It cost a lot of money. So he went in as a draftsman for a company in Cambridge called Pi, and they were making television cameras. And that's how he met the people in the Cambridge Flying Club. So he kept flying until 1965. But I think it was very difficult for him because his whole life was the forces, and really not to be able to continue that, I think was hard. This is my father after the war in his uniform at Cambridge, where he used to train the Air Training Corps, the young boys to fly. So he carried doing that. So not just only did he do private flying, he also taught young boys to fly. We also discovered that one of the Spitfires that's still flying today, my father flew quite a few times, and we got in touch with them. This plane is still flying today. And he flew it with 310 Squadron.
Did you have the chance to sit in?
I have had a chance to sit in it. They wouldn't let me fly it. I have been in a Spitfire though. GADEI. And that was the last plane that he flew. We're doing the roll. Look. They took me up in that plane a few months ago, and it was quite an experience. There are the White Cliffs. It's open cockpit. Also, one of the other things I do is I go to some of the memorial functions for the Memorial Association for Free Czechoslovak Veterans. And there is a winged lion in Prague, which has about 2,500 names of RAF people that served here during the war, and his name is on the memorial.
You have a keen interest in music. How many instruments do you play?
4. I did play 4. So basically, I went to school at King's College Choir School in Cambridge. They've got a very well-known choir that sings at Christmas. The big chapel in Cambridge, that's part of it. And it's a very musical school. So I did the choral work. I learnt to play the piano, the flute, the organ and the violin. I was pretty good at the piano. So the organ was easier because it does a lot of things for you, whereas the piano, you just have to play the piano. So yeah, I enjoy music, listening to music. I don't play, even though we have a very big organ in the next room. And then after that, I left and went to King's Ely Cathedral School in Ely. They were all boarding schools, so that was a hard thing if you're going away from home at the age of 7. I don't think my dad really wanted me to go, but there you go.
Do you speak Czech?
No, unfortunately. Well, the only thing that my father ever taught me was a drinking song in the bath. And I've got a funny story about this. I took my father to a Battle of Britain reunion at Bentley Prior in London with a colleague of his, and all the Czechs were around the table, and I was just waiting to take them home. And they said, "Does anybody know a Czech drinking song?" And I think I was about 18. And I went, "Yeah, I do." And they said, "Well, go on then." So it was glug, 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 gloria, yak set o pi whoppy pee wah wah, glug, 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 gloria, yak set o pi whoppy ya. I don't know what it means, but that's the sort of only Czech that I know. I know the pivo and the other small words, but no. I wished he taught me, but there you go.
How did your Czech heritage influence your life?
I loved it. The family are quite... My father comes from a very small village, and they're sort of, I would say, agricultural. So when I took the family back, we'd go and they'd have chickens and rabbits and goats and pigs and all the things in the garden. They'd grow everything, then they'd pickle everything, like a corky, and I think that's a bit of grounding for everyone, to not forget their roots. We visited my father's grave, which is in Lipnitz, a small cemetery. He wanted to go back, so we actually took him back and buried him, you know, with his family. My father wasn't unusual. It was, you know, a lot of them were shot, a lot of them were imprisoned. So he's technically one of the fortunate ones. Doesn't make it any easier.